She walked back to her apartment in pajamas, dropped a rent check, and vanished days later. Her bed was unmade, a pillowcase missing, and a pajama sleeve stained with her blood. Her dog waited inside. Her phone and keys were gone. Friends feared the worst. A terrified 911 call, made weeks earlier, revealed she'd been scared of her roommate. He said he loved her. He said he'd never hurt her. But library computer logs told a darker story. Searches about how long a body takes to decay. A map zoomed again and again to an isolated canyon. 2 weeks after she disappeared, detectives found her body buried under rocks in Modjeska Canyon. Her roommate was arrested. The evidence was circumstantial, but relentless. A trail of small, ordinary things that became impossible to ignore. This is a story of trust turned deadly. Maribel Ramos had the kind of presence that made people feel steadier just by being near her. Born small in stature, but vast in quiet confidence, she carried herself like someone who had learned early to take care of others. Growing up, Maribel stepped into roles most children her age don't. She was studious, ambitious, a caretaker at home when her mother worked long hours to keep the family afloat. Her dream was simple and clear: to serve, protect, and one day wear a uniform. She followed that dream into the U.S. Army in August 2001. And the discipline of military life carved a new edge into a personality already shaped by responsibility. Her time in uniform changed her in ways neither she nor anyone who loved her could have predicted. She was deployed to South Korea and later to Iraq, where she served 2 tours and rose to the rank of sergeant. Those years left her with the pride and scars of service, a resilience, a hypervigilance, and memories that sometimes lingered in the small, private hours. When she returned to civilian life in 2008, she carried that resilience into education, studying criminal justice at California State University, Fullerton, and deciding to work for Veteran Services. She wanted her next chapter to be one of community and connection. By 2013, at 36, Maribel's life looked like the kind of second act millions of veterans hope for. School, a steady plan, family close by. She lived in an apartment in Orange, California, with a Yorkshire Terrier at her feet and a dogged belief that the future would be steadier now. She planned to graduate, travel, maybe start a family. She still loved long walks and hikes, and her friends describe her as meticulous, almost ritualistic. Someone who made her bed every morning and tracked time the way most people track breaths. The night she disappeared began like so many others. On May 2nd, 2013, surveillance captured Maribel walking into the apartment complex manager's office to drop off her rent check around 8:30 p.m. She wore pajama bottoms and a vest top, comfortable clothes that suggested she intended to settle in for the night. Her roommate, Kong Choi Casey Joy, told police later that the two had argued that evening about unpaid rent. Maribel had reportedly told him he needed to move out. According to her sister and friends, this was not an unusual disagreement. But there was an edge to it this time, one that lingered. When she didn't appear for class the next day, nor show up for a weekly softball game she rarely missed, alarm bells went off. Maribel ran her life with punctuality. Being a no-show without a message was unlike her. Her car was still parked outside. Her dog was inside, awake, confused. Her purse, keys, and phone, the tiny anchors people depend on, were gone. Friends and family told police she had never simply drifted away before. Her absence raised a handful of theories. Had she left with someone? Had she been lured somewhere? The simplest explanation felt wrong. At the apartment, a search turned up small but crucial detail: a bed left unmade and a missing pillowcase. Investigators who knew Maribel's routines recognized those small anomalies for what they often are: signs that the ordinary has been interrupted. The homicide unit was called in. The conversation inside the home changed from missing person to suspicious disappearance. With no sign of forced entry and nothing obviously ransacked, detectives began to trace pulses. Phone activity, social interactions, digital footprints. Casey's account was immediate and layered. He reported Maribel missing and claimed to have spoken with her the night before. He said she was drunk, loud, and telling him to leave. He volunteered information, answered questions, and allowed police to take DNA swabs and photographs. But even as he cooperated, oddities accumulated. Neighbors would later report seeing him parked and watching his activities swirled around the apartment, watching in a way that suggested more than curiosity. He told different stories about deep scratches on his arms. Sometimes they were from falling into bushes. Other times they came from a fishing line. When police took photographs, the scratches looked straight and deep, the kind that had come from wire or barbed fence. 2 weeks prior to her disappearance, Maribel had made a 911 call that would later become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. On that call, she was trembling and afraid. She said she had told Casey she had a gun in the house, a claim she later admitted was a bluff. What she feared, she told the dispatcher, was that Casey would do something violent to her. In the clipped, urgent way of ex-service members who have seen danger, she said she might have to defend herself. The call revealed a woman who had been pushed to the edge by a situation she did not feel she could control. Investigators scoured the apartment. They found a pajama shirt tucked away that matched the bottoms captured on surveillance footage. The same clothing Maribel had worn when she dropped the rent check. The shirt had a smear of blood on the sleeve. Forensic tests confirmed the blood contained Maribel's DNA. No other person's DNA was found on the garment. For detectives, the presence of her blood inside the apartment, combined with the missing pillowcase and the abruptness of her disappearance, tightened an invisible noose around the possibility that something violent had occurred within those walls. Meanwhile, Casey's online activity began to look increasingly suspicious. He took to social media and message boards to write about Maribel in the past tense and to share details about the search. When police said unbroken, round-the-clock surveillance on him, the threads of his behavior formed a pattern. He posted about her as if already grieving. He accepted media attention readily, and he made statements that many found off-kilter and performative. Yet the case at that point was largely circumstantial. Patterns and oddities, not incontrovertible proof. Detectives pursued every lead. One day at a public library, an investigator sat and watched a monitored computer screen. A library computer had been used by Casey because detectives had seized his laptop. They watched as Casey searched for information online. Queries about how long it took a human body to decompose. Maps queries that drew close to a remote stretch of canyonland. He zoomed into a specific, out-of-the-way spot off the side of a rural road, not part of any common hiking trail. He focused on that map for a long time. Within hours, police were moving toward that canyon. When detectives brought Casey in for tougher questioning, his demeanor changed. He was confident at first, chatty, even, but pressure made him storm out of one interview, and it made him walk, in the eyes of detectives, toward handcuffs. During a search, authorities found military identification tags that belonged to Maribel. Small, everyday objects that bind people to their identities, a nameplate on a chain, surfaced in Casey's possession. It was a detail that, in the mosaic of circumstantial evidence, held weight. The prosecution's case would rest on the accumulation of those pieces rather than a single smoking gun. They painted Casey as obsessive, financially adrift, and emotionally entangled with a woman who had made clear she wanted him out of her life. They highlighted his scratches, his contradictory statements, the bloody pajama shirt, his search history, the map zooming, and the fact that he had been alone in the apartment with Maribel the night she disappeared. The 911 call, where Maribel confessed to bluffing about a gun because she feared him, underscored motive. If there was no direct DNA tying Casey to the act of killing, there was a constellation of evidence that prosecutors argued made his guilt impossible to ignore. The defense fought back, pointing to the limits of the physical evidence. There was no definitive cause of death. There were no witnesses who saw a struggle. No fingerprints or DNA directly connected Casey to the act of violence that ended Maribel's life. The defense argued for reasonable doubt. They suggested that Maribel might have left voluntarily, that she might have had a medical event, or that someone else could have been involved. They argued that circumstantial cases, by their nature, leave room for alternative explanations, and that it would be wrong to convict without direct proof. In the courtroom, those two narratives faced off. The prosecution building a story piece by piece, like pencils in a bundle that become unbreakable together. The defense chipping away at each piece, trying to show gaps and fractures. Witnesses testified to the dynamic between Maribel and Casey, his possessiveness, his insistence on staying in the apartment, his spending to try to impress her, the restraining orders and arrests from earlier chapters of his life that hinted at an unstable past. Friends and family painted Maribel as dependable and punctual, someone who would not simply vanish without explanation. As jurors absorbed testimony, they were asked to imagine two realities. One where a woman is killed in her own bed and her body taken to a remote place by the person who lived with her, and one where a woman leaves on her own or dies for reasons unrelated to foul play. The prosecution's job was to make the first scenario feel like the only reasonable one. It relied on motive and opportunity, on the 911 call, on the bloody clothing and the map zooming, and on Casey's behavior in the days and weeks after Maribel's disappearance. In the months that followed, the case dominated headlines and memorials. Friends and family organized vigils, handed out flyers, and kept her name alive in the public imagination. Maribel's mother had died years earlier, leaving her more alone in the world but more determined than ever to keep her family together. Her niece accepted her degree in her stead, carrying Maribel's photo onto the stage, a moment of private grief made public, a way to honor what the family believed Maribel had fought for in life. The jury ultimately weighed the circumstantial evidence and returned a verdict. Casey Joy was guilty of second-degree murder. The sentence, 15 years to life, was met by a courtroom reaction of gasps and tears. To the family, it felt like a measure of justice at last, though no sentence could recreate the life that had been lost. For Casey, the conviction marked the end of one chapter defense, and the beginning of another: appeals, petitions, letters to judges. He maintained his innocence in letters and interviews, insisting that the case had not proved what it needed to prove. Years passed. The legal wheels continued to turn. Parole hearings and denials punctuated time like calendar marks. For Maribel's family, there was a slow work of living around the absence. Holidays without her laugh at the table, milestones she could not see, an ache that never softened. Her friends remembered the woman who volunteered, who tutored, who was planning trips and a life beyond campus. Her niece carried on a degree she could not accept in person. The small star tattoo remained a stubborn, tender clue in photographs, a reminder of the person hidden by the crime. Looking back, the case drew attention for how modern investigations often hinge on ordinary things: a library computer, a GPS map, a social media post, a small smear of blood on a pajama sleeve. It served as a reminder that technology and human behavior intersect in ways the criminal mind sometimes forgets. The footprint of crime are often digital as much as they are physical. Detectives trace a path from a camera in an apartment complex to a 911 call, to a library search, to a remote canyon. Each discovery did not stand alone, but leaned on the next, creating a structure of inference strong enough for jurors to follow. There were also unresolved questions that circulated long after the verdict. How exactly did Maribel die? Why was her pillowcase missing from the bed where she slept? What happened to the rest of her belongings? Those questions would never have satisfying answers because decomposition had erased the microscopic clues that might have told a different story. The loss of certainty is itself a wound. It forces families and communities to live with not only the absence of a person, but with the ambiguity of some final details. Maribel's life, however, did not reduce to the manner of her death. Friends remembered a woman of stubborn joy who loved her dog, who kept strict routines, who worked hard to finish school while supporting those around her. She was a soldier who had jumped out of planes and served in war zones, a student who wanted to help veterans, a sister who helped a niece with math, and a niece who would take her photo to graduation. Her story is threaded with service, with ambition, and with the small, everyday gestures that make someone beloved. For those making a video about Maribel, the challenge is to hold both truths: the intensity of tragedy and the fullness of the life. True crime can easily tilt toward morbid curiosity, lowering a person to an artifact of violence. But Maribel's story resists that flattening. It asks viewers to remember a woman who was loved, who had plans, who was trusted enough to let someone share a roof in life, and who, heartbreakingly, paid the cost of that trust with her life. The legal aftermath plays its part in the narrative arc: arrest, trial, conviction, appeal attempts, parole hearings. But the human aftermath, the gap at graduations, the empty chair holiday tables, the silence in certain phone lines, is the part that resonates longest. The room where she used to make her bed is now a room where someone else lives, where a different narrative will unfold. For Maribel's family, that room is a repository of memory. In the public sphere, the case became an object lesson in how circumstantial evidence, when assembled with care, can meet the burden of proof. Prosecutors liken each piece to a pencil. One pencil breaks easily, but a bundle is hard to snap. Layer upon layer of small, ordinary evidence. A torn pajama sleeve, a library search, a missing pillowcase, a 911 call. Build a strong enough argument to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. But it is not only detectives and juries who must make sense of what happened. Communities heal slowly, through memorials and stories told aloud. Friends and family kept Maribel's name alive by telling stories about her laughter and her stubborn punctuality, about the way she tutored her niece and the way she spoke about traveling. The vigilance of those who loved her, mapping, searching, distributing flyers, pleading at vigils, made the case visible until police could follow the threads. Justice, in this case, took its form through a conviction and a sentence. But justice rarely feels absolute. It is uneven, slow, and partial, a legal answer to a human catastrophe. For the Ramos family, for Maribel's friends, for the small community that knew her, the conviction was a necessary closure, not an end to the grief. In the quiet, after the cameras left and the headlines faded, Maribel's life remains visible in other ways. Her niece carries a diploma she accepted on Maribel's behalf. Friends share the small rituals she loved, hikes she had planned and places she wanted to visit. The story of her life, buoyed by memory and retelling, resists being swallowed whole by the details of the crime. In retelling this case, it is possible to become consumed by the mechanism of violence, the how, and forget the why and the who that preceded it. Who was Maribel? A woman who served her country, who sought to build a life of service, who trusted others enough to let them into her home. Why did this happen? That is a question with both obvious and murky answers. Obsession, financial stress, and a rupture in boundaries that escalated into tragedy. The law decided one version of events beyond a reasonable doubt. The rest remains a mix of evidence, testimony, and human memory. The story ends, finally, on two parallel notes. The accountability that came through a courtroom and the ache that stayed with family and friends. Maribel Ramos's life was a collection of quiet commitments and bold service, and the violent way it closed is a reminder that safety is fragile even within the places we deem most secure. The canyon where she was found is a place of sand and scrub now, a geographic footnote on maps, but the memory of her is kept alive in the lives of those she loved and the small acts they performed to remember her. Her life reminds us that the people at the center of true crime stories are not just their endings. They are full stories of choices, service, and relationships. In remembering her this way, as student, soldier, sister, friend, her presence lingers beyond the facts of the case. The work of remembering, in the end, is the most human response to a life cut tragically short. They thought the story had ended when the shallow grave in Modjeska Canyon gave up its secret. They were wrong. The next chapters, the ones that dug under the surface of grief, the ones that spilled into courtrooms and jail corridors and the cold glow of late-night internet searches, were the ones that made people lean in and not sleep, the ones that asked how a life so full of small certainties could be taken and folded into so many puzzling fragments. The arrest felt like a punctuation mark the community had been waiting for, but arrests are shorthand. They are an official hand on a larger Messier book. What followed was a slow, excruciating process of threading facts into a narrative that a jury could accept. Motive means opportunity. Each a separate string, each vulnerable to snapping. The most shocking parts, the ones that turned neighborly curiosity into a national story, were not necessarily the macabre details of how a person died. They were the intimate human ugliness of obsession, the ordinary objects that became instruments of incrimination, and the ways desperate people try to tidy a life after it shatters. Inside the courtroom, testimony arrived like waves. Witnesses who had once been background characters became grotesquely central. Neighbors who had watched the couple shuffle through small domestic fights. The girlfriend's sister, who could describe the exact way Maribel folded her clothes. A barista who remembered Casey buying the woman a drink and lingering too long. Each witness brought a shard of normal life that, when aligned, formed a picture of a relationship that had skewed from cohabitation to control. There were scenes that read like parables of modern obsession. Casey's purchases, laid out by prosecutors, told a story. The tattoo meant to impress, the wardrobe overhaul, the cosmetic surgeries he allegedly paid for, all the attempts to reinvent himself into someone Maribel might choose. The defense countersailed with an old, effective legal strategy. Explain the money, explain the purchases, make motive murkier. They said Casey's spending was an effort to rebuild his life, not a manipulative scheme. They told a jury that men buy things to feel better sometimes. They buy necklaces or faces or haircuts to stitch a new identity. Motive, the defense insisted, required more than pity or longing. Perhaps the most chilling evidence was not physical but digital. The public library computer. The search queries frozen on a screen. The map zoomed and zoomed into the exact crag where Maribel's body would be found. A typed search asking how long a body takes to decompose. Those searches were a modern kind of footprint. Prosecutors presented them like a slideshow. See here. See here again. Watch as the accused circles the place where he would later hide a life. The lawyer's question at the stand was simple. Why were you zooming in on that place? Casey's answer was blunt and rehearsed. He didn't. He had not done those searches. Other patrons used the library. The computer could have been used by anyone. It is an old lesson in modern crime. The web remembers. You can't ask the internet not to bring receipts. Prosecutors brought forensic techs to the stand to explain how the computer usage logs and timestamps aligned with Casey's alleged presence. Defense attorneys tried to make plausible deniability into a reasonable doubt. They asked jurors to imagine another person, another set of hands, to find space for human fallibility. But the chain was long, and as it stretched, it suffered fewer breaks than the defense could comfortably explain. Then there was a 911 call. A voice cut with fear, the cadence of someone who had been trained to assess danger and decided nonetheless she was threatened. The recording, played in a courtroom that felt hushed with the weight of meaning, was more than evidence. It was an intimate monologue of escalation. Maribel's voice was not that of somebody spinning a story. It was the sound of a neighborly, ordinary life cracking at the edges. Her claim that she had lied about a gun, that she had said she had one only to scare Casey away, was itself a tragic irony. A small bluff meant to protect became a piece of the puzzle that prosecutors used to show motive and fear. The pillowcase, the missing bedding, the blood-smeared pajama sleeve that matched what she had been wearing on the rent deposit footage. These small domestic details felt obscene and tender in equal measures. They were ordinary items from an ordinary night that had been turned inside out. Forensic specialists explained in dry, clinical terms how blood spatter and smears are interpreted, patterns of touch, directionality, transfer, while the family sat in the gallery clutching photographs like lifelines. When a juror glanced up and saw Maribel's photo, a woman who had once accepted the world in careful, scheduled breaths, there was an electric mixture of sorrow and resolve. The prosecution worked to build a psychological portrait of Casey, not a caricature of evil, but the subtly terrifying version of someone who crosses the boundary from affection to ownership. Witnesses described his clinginess, the repeated conversations with family about his fixation, the restraining order his sister had once sought. Prosecutors contrasted this with Maribel's documented competence and routine, a military woman who slept on a schedule, who made her bed, who rarely missed a commitment. The juxtaposition was powerfully simple. She kept her world tidy. He could not accept that he had been refused. The defense questioned every inference. They raised the absence of DNA from anyone else, the impossibility of reconstructing a cause of death due to decomposition, the lack of direct eyewitnesses to an act of violence. They subpoenaed alternative leads, asked about unknown acquaintances, and tried to make the forensic gaps feel like yawning holes. Circumstantial evidence, the defense argued, can build a story, but stories are not proof. To many observers, this sounded like an appeal to reason. To the family, it felt like the ancient strategy of delay and doubt. Courtroom drama is theater honed by law. There were moments that read like stage scenes. The prosecutor pacing a little when concluding, the defense counsel leaning forward with face folded by concern, the judge reading from a bench like an arbiter of fate, the jury, peering over the rails of their impartiality, carried the weight of deciding someone's life, a terrible ordinary duty in a world that seldom offers easy answers. When the guilty verdict for second-degree murder came, the reaction was a mixture of relief and complicated grief. In the gallery, family members sobbed, a release of a pressure that had built in secret for months. There were those who argued the sentence was insufficient. Others held their hands together as if bracing for an echoing absence that would not be filled by a conviction. Casey remained defiant, writing letters from jail that alternated between self-pity and accusation, one day confessing abiding love for the woman he'd been convicted of killing, the next day claiming the legal system had been blind to other possibilities. The sentencing was a public ritual of condemnation and a private ritual of revenge. The state measured a life in years. 15 to life, the judge pronounced, and the family clung to the sense that accountability had arrived. But even with a conviction, the case slid into the slow undercurrent of appeals and parole hearings, legal processes that would stretch grief into longer seasons. Time, the family had learned, does not knit wounds so much as it teaches how to live with them. If the trial had been shocking in its own way, the aftermath supplied softer shocks that lasted longer. Pages of letters from Casey to the judge, his public statements to journalists, and the odd interview from behind prison glass became small, surreal reminders that the man convicted continued to exist as a human being with wants and fears. He published pieces, chapters of a self-made narrative that insisted on his innocence, and for a while his words circulated freely online, provoking anger and mockery and, for a handful of readers, sympathy. The family read these letters like salted wounds. The parole process brought new public attention and cycles. Each request for release forced the family to relive the trial in miniature. Hearings, testimony, psychological evaluations. The board's reasons for denial were often procedural, citing ongoing risk assessments and the depth of the harm. For those who had insisted that justice had been served, the denials were brief satisfaction. For the family, each hearing was a fresh foray back into trauma, a reminder that legal closure is often partial and conditional. But the real shock, the thing that people spoke about in quiet hours, was how ordinary the accumulation of evidence had been. No single piece was dramatic in itself. A red check dropped into a rent box, a library computer with a timestamp, a small tattoo recognized by a distant relative. It was the way those tiny acts, when woven together, formed a rope that would hang around a person's crime. That is what made the case terrifying. That the modern social fabric, email logs, surveillance cameras, careless purchases, a single 911 call, can be worked into a net of culpability. Even after the legal machinery had mostly done its work, the social aftershocks continued. Maribel's name stayed visible in small, beautiful ways. Her niece marching across a stage holding a photograph, a stolen joy reclaimed, became a symbol of what the family refused to let go. Friends started a scholarship in her name, dedicated to veterans seeking to study criminal justice. A small plaque was raised at a local hiking trail she loved. Rituals like these are how communities stitch meaning back into broken seams. At the same time, the store exposed the uneasy relationship between public fascination and private grief. True crime audiences poured over the details of the case, dissecting social media posts and courtroom transcripts with an intensity bordering on hunger. For the family, this was another kind of violence. Their loss turned into content, debated and ranked by strangers. There is a moral cost to public consumption of pain, a flattening that turns lives into plot points. The family tried to navigate this with dignity, requesting privacy at the funeral and asking the press to steer clear their home. They wanted remembrance, not performance. A decade later, the technicalities still matter. Parole dates pushed forward, appeals filed and denied, a life remade within concrete walls. Casey's eventual parole eligibility dates are a mathematical echo of the sentence. They are a countdown that divides years into what is legally possible and what is morally palatable. For some, parole hearings are a dull administrative fact. For grieving families, they are a return to the day. Each reconsideration conjures new trauma. The last pages of a story like this are never tidy. There is no single final part that resolves everything. Instead, there are small closures. The scholarship established, the niece finishing graduate school, friends returning to the canyon to leave flowers. There are also lingering questions that will never be fully answered. The exact sequence of events in a decomposed body, the fate of missing personal items, the private interior life of the accused. The law resolves surroundings. It cannot restore certainty about everything. Yet, even among unresolved fragments, there are threads that matter. Maribel's life, her service, her plans, her laughter, reasserted itself when family and friends told stories that refused to let her be simply an object of curiosity. In small home videos and in letters from her army unit to her family, she reappeared. The paratrooper with a stubborn smile, the student who wanted to help veterans, the sister who tutored quietly. Those memories are antidotes to the way her life was stolen and dissected. They are how the people who loved her choose to remember her. Not as a set of forensic facts, but as a person with a future that was cruelly cut short. If you press the story for its final shock, it is that violence can live inside the most mundane of arrangements. A shared apartment, a rent dispute, a friendship that crosses lines. The true horror is not always in graphic detail, but in the way ordinary trust can be weaponized by obsession. The legal system can punish. It can imprison. It can glean closure in numbers and dates. But what the law cannot do, what no sentence can ever accomplish, is restore the life that could have been lived. In the end, the canyon where Maribel was found remains both a geographic footnote and a haunted space in the family's memory. It is a place that testifies to loss in the blunt language of the earth. A scrap of scrubland, an out-of-the-way pull-off that the accused apparently chose. For some members of the public, the canyon is a curiosity. For the family, it is a wound. They visit it rarely, with hands full of flowers and the grateful hope that retelling her story will, in some small way, continue her life for others. For storytellers and producers, the final responsibility is ethical, to honor Maribel's full humanity, to resist the temptation to sensationalize, and to hold the audience's attention not for thrill, but for remembrance. True crime's allure is undeniable, but when it is handled with care, the genre can become a vessel for memory rather than a spectacle of suffering. So the last scene is not a neat bow. It is a small room where a niece holds a diploma, where a friend reads an old text message aloud and laughs and cries at once, where a veteran's reunion includes a quiet toast to a fallen comrade. It is the family placing a plaque on a bench of park she loved, simple words hammered into metal, in memory of Maribel Ramos, soldier, sister, friend. It is modest, human, and true. There is an ending, but it is not the end. Maribel's name keeps moving forward through the lives she touched, through the scholarship applicants, the veteran she might have helped, the niece who carries her photograph. And the legal narrative, appeals, parole boards, the dull grind of administrative justice, will continue to turn pages. The shock that once shocked will fade into the day-to-day, but the economic, social, and emotional residues will persist. A family altered, a community more vigilant, and a cautionary tale about how fragile ordinary trust can be. Please, kindly subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on the notification bell. Thanks for watching.